long time for concerns about racial justice to become important to me, but I think knowing that they went to Africa and devoted themselves to ministry with people there in a subtle way influenced me even then. I can remember at one point when they had come home on furlough as they used to in those days, and they would unpack drums and of their materials that they had brought back, and they would have works of art that they had brought. And I remember a neighbor of ours seeing this said something very racist when he saw some beautifully carved ivory heads. There are other reasons why those wouldn't be appropriate now, but they were works of art. This man said something ugly and racist, and I don't think my uncle challenged him then, but later on I heard him talk about how disgusting he found that, and they were helpful in shaping my racial attitudes even at an early age, I would say.
You know, it's so rewarding, and probably for all of us. That's not my phone, right? No, I'm always fearful. What's so encouraging, warming for all of us is to recognize those times in our lives when, as a young kid, we were drawn to compassion and kindness, and probably couldn't even name what it was, and maybe we can share some of those stories later if there's time. But it's amazing how it's the sense of who people are and how they live that formed a memory and a call to you as a young kid. So it's almost like the energy and the spirit of love that grounds us, that speaks beyond what to people that we don't even imagine it affects. So thank you on that.
Another aspect of their influence was that, as I said, they were Southern Baptists, as my mother had been before she married my Presbyterian father. We went to our local neighborhood Presbyterian church. I had so many Baptist relatives who challenged Presbyterian me over things like my baptism and whether I had been saved and things like that. I think that led me, for my age, to become articulate about things like that, defending my baptism, my theological tradition, and that too must have been part of what molded me and turned me in a particular direction.
So how old were you then? Were you a teenager? I wanted to ask you about your teenage years. I mean, how old?
This probably was as soon as I was, well, I think of childhood and grade school, and my uncle would say things like that in kind of a partly joking but not joking way because of how Baptists viewed and view us Presbyterians. So I had to learn to talk about that, and then later on as well as I got older. And so I think my mother even had to be convinced to, even though her sons received baptism at early ages. But that was part of my development, and I was aware of a need to be able to talk about things like that.
So you graduated from high school and you went to college, and what kind of decision was that? And
let me linger in high school a bit, if I may. And that is, so when I was around 9, we moved to a suburban area. We joined a large suburban church that in some ways had a dynamic like DCPC in terms of the number of people, the number of activities and programs. In those days, it was more typical for there to be booming suburban churches. So I was in a youth group that had 100 or more in the youth choir. All of that was an important part of my formation. In those days, we had, at one point, a minister who came who people said, intending it to be a compliment, that he preached like a Baptist. He was small c, charismatic, impressive and powerful in a lot of ways. And one thing I do recall is that he, early in his time with us, probably when I was in the 9th or 10th grade, he started talking to me about ministry and thinking that I should consider whether I might be called. So I did begin to think about things like that even then. It was never something I wanted to talk up because, well, the way I thought about it, this is kind of a caricature sure, but if there were, excuse me, little old ladies in the church who were thrilled at the idea I might become a minister, I didn't want to disappoint them if I ended up not going in that direction. So it was more of an internal thing. When I went to college, I had a lot of balls in the air about what I might do. I was genuinely interested in the law, interested in political things. I thought I might go to law school. In those days, it was important to be able to, well, for many of us, there were no longer student deferments, but I was in Navy ROTC because I thought if I was going to go into the service, I would just as soon do it as a naval officer as not do that. So that was one of the things I was considering. Another was State Department. I passed the first rung of the State Department exam, but did not go on to pursue that. So as I say, I had a number of options in view at the time. Halfway through college, the war had ended, so it felt safe, but at the same time, I had a legal obligation if I left the Naval ROTC. So at some risk, I decided to leave Naval ROTC, and I knew that I might have to do this. But the reason I did it at that time had to do with my possible call to ministry, that I felt that I didn't have a moral objection to serving in the Navy, but I felt that if I was headed toward ministry, for me it would be a detour along the way to my more important goal.
So where'd you go to college?
I went to Vanderbilt.
Okay, so you went to Vanderbilt and you explored all kinds of, law. And what was it that led you to go into ministry? Did you feel a sense of calling that early, or were you interested in the historical nature of studying who was Jesus, or was it the mystical, or did you go into, what was that?
I was interested in the first place in the scholarly study of what we were doing. I felt as if I'd only had hints of it in what I'd learned in church and Sunday school and the like, so I wanted to know more. Mm-hmm. And I had not decided on ministry as such. There were a couple of influences in those days. I started reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer my sophomore year. My mother had given me a book she had picked up for me at the Montreat Women's Conference. It was, I forgot the title of it, but it was sort of an introduction to Bonhoeffer written in the form of a movie script. This was odd. I had taken it with me. My language, my first 2 years in college was Russian. I'd gone on a trip to Russia. I had that book about Bonhoeffer there, which was slightly surreal to be in Moscow reading Bonhoeffer. But when I got back, I started reading The Cost of Discipleship and Letters and Papers from Prison. So I really was drawn in. And the impact to me was that this was someone from a professional family. He himself could not have been more scholarly, but he was drawn ever more deeply into Christian faith and into taking risks with his life in answer to the call of Christ. So that impressed me and still does.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that it was your uncle and aunt as you were a kid in the pictures in the Bible book. And so it's the impact of individuals on faith and calling. And I think for all of us, it's what we do that makes a difference. It's who we are that makes a difference. It's being in the world that people see and respond to. And so it was human beings that...
Right. I can mention another important experience in those days. That was the death of the mother of a close friend. It was the closest experience I had with death other than that of an elderly grandparent, something like that. So it led me to wrestle with questions about life and death and what we believe and what is important. Other influences, partly connected with that, were experiencing worship in other churches different from how I had grown up. As a college student, I enjoyed the freedom of not feeling like I had to go every Sunday, and I would say in those days I went semi-regularly, and enjoyed Saturday nights some. But as a freshman, there was a Methodist church, large Methodist church within easy walking distance. It did not suit my needs, so I did not continue going regularly there. Later, a few of my friends and I would go to, some of you may know, Westminster Church in Nashville, a few miles from the Vanderbilt campus. And that was an interesting experience of worship that in some ways was more formal and Book of Common Worship-like, but they did some new and different things too. I remember during Advent, the choir processed to Prepare Ye the Way of the Lord from Godspell, and it was really powerful. I really liked that, and I remember hearing sermons that were more deliberately theological. I remember a sermon by Hartley Hall, who later was president of Union Seminary, from John, I'm forgetting the chapter, but Jesus, John 17, Jesus in his high priestly prayer prays, and this is eternal life, to know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So I realized this is what realized eschatology is. It's not about just the distant future and what happens after we're dead, but this is eternal life, to know Jesus Christ and to live and act in that knowledge. So it was interesting to get new perspectives. The summer after I finished college, well, the one other thing I did in college, thinking about the possibility of ministry, my last year I took intensive German because I wanted to be able to read theological German in case I went to graduate school, so that was part of my preparation. I'd been admitted to law school, that was my plan, but then a professor from Louisville Seminary came to my home church. He had come for Holy Week services when I was a senior, and his visit was interrupted by, he'd been crossing a busy street to get coffee after one of the church services. He was hit by a car and was in the hospital. My father attended him, and after I had graduated and was back home, he came back to complete that series of services. I got to be with him and have dinner with him a couple of times. His name was Ulrich Mauser. He was a German, had grown up with that background. He was the same age as my father. And reading him and hearing him preach on the Sermon on the Mount was, again, it drew me more into wanting to know these things and to study these things more deeply. So I decided to apply to Louisville Seminary, and one of the turning points for me was the day when I put into the mail a letter to Louisville Seminary accepting the offer of admission, and to Vanderbilt Law School saying thanks but no thanks.
What drew you to Louisville for one, and what drew you to seminary? You said you wanted to, can you expand on reading Bonhoeffer and meeting these people and the Sermon on the Mount and who these human beings were? What was it that you wanted for your life, and how did you imagine that might look? Or did you just not know, and it was just more?
I was still thinking about the possibility of ministry, but I was interested, first of all, in having access to these things for myself, deeper knowledge, more scholarship, things that as I said, I felt had been hinted at in my experience with ministers and other church professionals, but I hadn't gotten enough of to suit me. So Louisville Seminary is where my home pastor, who had been so influential on me, had been, and his predecessors. Memphis is sort of in Louisville territory, as a lot of Tennessee is. Also, one thing I was interested in then was that at the time before Presbyterian Reunion, Louisville was related to the PCUS, Southern Presbyterian, and the UPC-USA, which we thought of as the Northern Church then. And even then, if I was going to go into ministry, I wanted to be open to the possibility of calls anywhere in the country. So that shaped my thinking at that time.
So take us on the story of you enter seminary, and you have a sense of why you're going. What happened there that said to you, I want to go into ministry, and then how did that emerge as a call?
Let me back up briefly from that to a point. I think it was, maybe I was in college, I can't remember, but as I thought about this idea of call, I wrote to a young associate pastor who had also been influential on me in my home church. His tenure had lasted only about a year and a half, so you can imagine the sorts of things that might have gone on. I hadn't realized at the time how short tenures can be in situations like that. But I wrote him to ask him about what it means to be called, because as people talked about that, I thought there was the implication that you needed to hear the voice of God directly, like Jeremiah or whatever else. But so he wrote me a very thoughtful letter talking about considering the variety of gifts one had, of experiences, and whether it might be possible that God was at work through those things, and that those things might indeed constitute a call to ministry. So I grew toward that view more and more. I do remember that when I told my parents I was going to go to seminary, my father was very direct with me, not trying to say, to forbid me, he would not have presumed of that, but he was concerned, one, about whether I was really called, and I do think that he had the idea that I needed a burning bush experience or something like that. But also I appreciated his speaking realistically as a physician who had known many ministers as patients, and he didn't want me to have any sugar-coated, honeyed view of what ministry was going to be like. And that was based on his experience with many ministers. So I appreciated his wanting me to think realistically about that. And I remain grateful for that. I know of some people whose parents have been adamantly opposed to their announcing that they felt called to ministry and wanted to go to seminary. We wanted you to be a doctor or something like that. So that's a sadly common story too. So some ministers who do persevere despite family opposition have sort of been forged in the furnace that way too. That was not my experience, but I appreciated the realistic thinking I was encouraged to do.
Which is really important. My dad was a minister. Both my grandfathers were ministers, so it's an interesting place. Back on I remember I'm struck by the difference between the burning bush experience and then that person that said to you, it's how you see God working in your life. And when I look at my life, I see it backwards. So, and you talked about as a younger kid, wondering, being called. So, did you reflect then, or can you reflect now on how you see God working in your life and calling you to ministry?
I believe I had and have a call, and I believe God has been at work in my life and in my ministry. As you talked about looking at God in our lives, the words of Frederick Buechner came to mind. You know how Buechner has written many such things, but about listen to your life, and that we do find God to be present in our own lives. So I have had confirmations of a sense of call along the way, but I've certainly had enough challenge to call that it has remained something to wrestle with. And I would encourage any young person to be aware of those things, the pros, the cons, the positive, the negative,
That's so honest and so,
all of that.
yeah, honest and realistic and thoughtful.
So you were asking about my experience of becoming drawn to ministry, not just theological study. Well, I found when I got to Louisville, it was expected that everyone was going to be part of field work, working in a congregation somewhere. So I went through the interview process. The church I ended up matched with was a large suburban church, much like the one I had mainly grown up in, about 100 miles from Louisville. I had good experiences. I took first steps in helping lead worship and worked mainly with youth, teaching Sunday school, working in youth ministry and the like. So I enjoyed that. It probably was not the depth of challenge I grew to experience later in ministry. It was sort of, well, I suppose it was very encouraging in that people thought of me as this nice young man who shows interest in ministry, and they were welcoming and affirming in almost every way. I did not have any real bumps in that experience, which, I don't know, maybe one should have bumps even sooner. But that was a positive experience. Between my second and third years of ministry, of seminary, excuse me, I did an internship at the PCOS Mission Board in Atlanta, which was a good experience in that I got to travel to visit churches, got to experience life in the bureaucracy of the larger church. And I found out that as wonderful as the experience had been of traveling and visiting lots of different kinds of churches, I found out that I did not want to be in bureaucratic ministry, and that I really did indeed feel called to ministry in a congregation. So it's a helpful experience in checking out good things and less good things, and so I went on from there. That it afforded me some useful contacts for what I did my last year of seminary and beyond. So in my last year of seminary, my work was on campus helping administer continuing education events, and got to meet a lot of the great guests who came in to be there, and got involved in the professor I mentioned who had been so influential as to make me decide to go to seminary had since left Louisville, had gone to Pittsburgh Seminary, and but some of my friends and I contrived to invite him back to be our baccalaureate speaker. So he kind of bookended my experience there in a way. At the same time, I was beginning to investigate the possibility of calls to churches. The head of staff of the church was on campus doing the interviewing, and then I went there. The church was in Northeast Florida. I visited there with my new wife. It was January. He took me sailing on the Saturday, the day before I was to preach for the PNC. I said, I think I hear the Lord calling me. And so that is, in fact, the church where I went. And again, it was middling to large suburban congregation, similar to where I had grown up. I had an almost ideal first call experience, which not all of my colleagues in ministry can say. I realized after I got there that there were some people in similar positions who were, for whatever reasons, losing those positions surprisingly soon. My senior colleague and I had lunch together just a few months into my tenure, and he said, "It is going okay, isn't it?" And we both sort of asked that question of each other and checked that out, because I found out that the tenure for a young associate pastor can be of concern in that way. So my first senior colleague was there for 2 years, then he left, and I had the opportunity to be the interim pastor of that church for a year, which was a great experience.
So you were associate for 2 years,
Yes.
and then the senior pastor, is that what
Well,
it was called?
I was still the associate pastor, but I was in effect the interim pastor. of
Oh,
that
you were
church,
interim.
too.
Now, in that denomination, could an interim pastor stay?
No.
No, you're just there until the call comes for
Right.
someone. Okay.
Right,
So you were there for a year,
right.
and then what?
Well, then I had graduate school in mind, seriously, for some time, so that was another iron I was moving around. So I went from there to Vanderbilt, I was on the track to get a PhD in Old Testament, and I did well in classes and exams. The part that I was less well equipped for was to complete a dissertation once I returned to full-time ministry. So, but it was a great experience. I learned a great deal. I would say for that chapter of my life, before and after too, I felt sort of on the fence between academic study and congregational ministry. So, so even while we were in Nashville then, I had the opportunity to work in churches. I was interim pastor of a suburban church for close to a year then. I was on the staff of Westminster in an interim capacity for a few months, and had some stimulating experiences that way. One thing I haven't mentioned, but it really has been important almost throughout my childhood, youth, and time since then too, is the importance of music in my life. I'm not a gifted musician, but I sang in choirs from early ages, and children's choir in that little neighborhood church, youth choir in my home church when I was growing up. Less so later, though. My last year of seminary, they brought in someone to start a choir, and I sang in the choir then as well. So it was recalling Westminster that brought that to mind to me again. That church had and has a super music program. One of the things I loved that they did regularly, they included singing the Psalms in worship in every service. And one of the stimulating things I recall from those days too is that when I was preaching a couple of times during that few months on the staff of that church, I had come up with something that wasn't lectionary related. I think it was a text from my exegesis exam that I turned into a sermon. But I chose a psalm, and it was fun to work with a musician who then wrote an arrangement for a psalm for that Sunday as I had chosen. So that was kind of heady too, and I've enjoyed working closely with musicians in every church where I have been.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before you all got here, I was here early along with Steve, and I was telling him that this morning I was reading the news and was really feeling down, and so then as a young kid, I was in a choir in my dad's church, and we sang this song. It goes, "Lead me, Lord, lead me in thy righteousness." I just sat in my house and just sang that song. So it's amazing how religious songs that touch the soul drive us. And this is, I was a kid, and I still am nurtured and comforted by that. So music held you and drew you.
Yes. And it gives us resources we draw on much later, as you were saying. My taste has changed over the years from what I was first exposed to in that little neighborhood church and in my suburban church. But even texts I remember from some of those things can be put to new and different use, and to think of something that to me has political relevance. when I was in my high school youth choir, we thought we were really singing great stuff when we sang the Holy City, which was important in many evangelical churches. And some people, as you know, have cited, as they talk about wanting to build a wall to keep people out, have talked about, oh, even the New Jerusalem has a wall. And of course, the gates are never shut. And in the song that I recall from my youth days is, and all who would might enter, and no one was denied. So we have to be careful about how we cite biblical texts and songs as well.
Yeah, keep those gates open. So we're back, and you were interim in a number of churches, correct?
More than one, right?
More than one, and then what? Then what happened?
We went from Nashville to Moncks Corner, South Carolina. So by that time, Laurie and I had been married for several years. We had a daughter who was born when I was in graduate school. Our moves coincided with pregnancies and waiting for children to come. So we went to South Carolina, where our son Will was born. That was a small town church. At the time, we probably had 100 some odd in worship now, which many churches in our day would be thrilled to have. We experienced some growth in those days. When we had been there for 3 years, we were starting new programs. There were good things happening. When we'd been there for 3 years, Hurricane Hugo struck, and it was as if it had wiped out all our progress, and as if we were starting from scratch, and not just for me and people in the church, but it was true for so many people in their own lives as things were literally blown away. One of the hard things in those days is that we saw some older people we felt in the next year or so who died of grief because they knew they would never see things as they had been again. So that was a challenging experience. I know people who live here and were here at the time have your own memories of Hugo. Part of my memory is the height of the storm there was in the middle of the night, and I had moved our children's mattresses to the hall away from all windows, and it felt miraculous at the time that they slept through the whole thing. So while I was terrified, it was a terrible experience. But rebuilding was a very difficult experience. Our house survived okay. There were trees crashing down all around us. The steeple was blown off our church, but the church was mainly okay. But it was the way nearly everyone's morale that was affected that was so particularly challenging.
Yeah, so for your congregants, when their world was stripped away, and there's a sense that you have nothing, and there's nothing that you can trust, and there's nothing that remains. How does a church respond to that? What does the church do and say, and how did that happen, that in time it regrew?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I remember the storm hit on Thursday night. The first Sunday afterward, we still had no power at home or at the church, but we did have worship, and I think we had 30 or so people there. The next week, I'd taken Laurie and our children to her aunt and uncle's house in Clemson so they could sort of live normally while we were digging out at home. But the Sunday after that, we had 60 or so. We might have had power back already. It was slow. I remember we had Halloween party for the children at the end of October. I remembered there had been a letter in the Charleston paper I had retorted to. The letter was criticizing churches that had Halloween parties. It was, the point of view some Christians on the right take that to take note of Halloween at all is wrong. But I wrote one about, let's see, I saw a green-skinned witch and so forth. But I went on about to say how risky it would have been for children to be out trick-or-treating normally when our streets were still lined with debris. And then I remember for Christmas, we were, I suppose life in the church was starting to feel more normal, but we had snow for Christmas, which was unusual in the low country of South Carolina. I remember there was an elder in the church who called me to say, didn't I think we ought to cancel worship in case some of the older people had an accident or anything like that. I said, well, Bob, I wouldn't want anyone to take a risk that made them feel uncomfortable, but I feel if the mall is open, we still ought to have church on Christmas Eve. But I remember that felt like such a blessing to see the debris-lined streets still covered with snow, and it felt like a healing thing then.
And then people came to worship.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
My goodness.
So actually the church was coming back and did the year, let's see, 2 years after that, we had a capital campaign to begin raising money for a new sanctuary, which they did not build until after we had left, but we have been back for that. Because Laurie, my wife, wanted our children to have the experience, she started a children's music program. And that has been really important in that church over many years since as well. And we were back for the funeral of an elderly friend several years ago, and the minister gave Laurie credit for much of what had happened there because of the programs that had emerged from that little children's music program. So that's a place where we could see seeds planted that had borne fruit and still do. So that was very gratifying.
Again, the power of music.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I know you ended up in Statesville, but
Right.
Was there anything in between?
There was in between. I was on the staff at Trinity Church in Atlanta, where John was as well. I was there for 6 years. It was and is a large church with great resources. It was music heaven. It was an exciting time to be in Atlanta for the Olympics and for the Braves to win the World Series. So it was, our children had some great experiences there too, as I did. So it was a time of growth and challenge. I began to look forward to being somewhere where I would be the person in charge and have and be able to preach regularly as well. So we went to Statesville in '98. I was head of staff there for 20 years. It's hard to realize. Some good things happened during that time. It was a time of some growth, some challenge for sure. We had a capital campaign, did a major renovation, started a new social service agency for feeding hungry people. This was thanks especially to the work of a retired Presbyterian mission worker in our church who, while on the session, had observed and compared notes with people in other churches that some of the same people are coming to all the churches seeking help, and this was a way of coordinating who knew what about whom and combining resources as well. So it really became an important agency. I was involved in its leadership for some time, and it still seems to thrive. I'm concerned about how that agency will be affected by some of the huge changes that are coming our way as many federal programs are being cut, and what are we going to tell people who are hungry and wondering how they're going to feed their children? So.
You mentioned a bit earlier the challenges of ministry. Can you share one or more? And I don't want to, you know.
I think maybe as I attained more years, became mature, felt myself getting closer to retirement, but maybe it was also because I was concerned about what I was observing in the world. I got a little more out there on some issues in the world. I began to be confronted over some things I did. Well, I'll back up briefly to soon after we arrived in Statesville, I got involved with a new program that actually our Chamber of Commerce had started for interested people called Standing Together Against Racism. My reason for getting involved was that our daughter, a new student at Statesville High School, encountered a lot of tension there. The administration had fired a black assistant principal. Some people tried to turn that into a hot racial issue. I thought the administration handled it very well because the white principal was promoted to administration and they brought in a black principal instead to show that it was not a matter of because the person who had been dismissed was black. But there was a lot of tension there. The new principal kind of changed the atmosphere for the better. I recall hearing at one point that he had suspended his own son. I recalled that with him once at someone's Christmas party. He said, "Yeah, my wife and my mother were really mad at me about that." But our daughter was experiencing something she had not before because they had been in a different sort of school atmosphere where we were in Atlanta. To try to address what she was experiencing in a constructive way, I chose to get involved in this Standing Together Against Racism group. The part that was enriching for me was that I got to know black leaders in the community. Another thing that happened to me around that time, and I've talked about this in a class here before when we had the class on the Presbyterian Church, slavery, Jim Crow, and racism. I learned from a book by a cousin that my great-great-grandfather had arrived in the Mississippi Delta with chained enslaved persons in tow to carve a plantation out of the wilderness. I might have been able to infer that looking back at my family's background, but I did not know that. I did not have direct knowledge of it. And that too made me want to be involved in a constructive way in addressing issues like this and to atone in some way, humanly speaking. So because I talked about some of this in public and about my having grown up in Memphis. King was assassinated in Memphis when I was in high school. I was invited to first to lead the MLK community worship once, and then to be the keynoter for the MLK community celebration, which was even in Statesville was kind of a heady experience. I began to be more outspoken about some issues like that, and when William Barber brought the Moral Monday to Statesville, I joined that demonstration, as did my predecessor and some people from my church. But the occasion was, I'm sure you remember the Moral Monday, the demonstrations in Raleigh. There were some people from our community, including the minister of the very progressive Baptist church in town. You might be surprised to know there's such a thing in Statesville, but there is, and some others from his church who got arrested in Raleigh. I didn't go as far as that. In fact, I didn't go to Raleigh for the demonstrations, but when Dr. Barber brought the Moral Monday to Statesville, I did join the demonstrations. So there were some people in my church who opposed my doing that and let me know afterward. And there began to be more than one issue concerning which some few people would oppose me. For example, there was someone who was opposed to my putting in social media expressions of concern about climate change and global warming. I said, when I was a Republican, I was an environmentalist. There really didn't used to be much difference in how Republicans and Democrats felt about some of these issues. It got politicized otherwise to serve others' agendas. So I had some issues over things like that to deal with in the latter years of my time in Statesville.
How did you deal with that?
I tried to speak to people who expressed those concerns in a reasonable way to explain how I had arrived at the point of wanting to do that. There were some who weren't satisfied by that, but there's some points at which you have to say, this is where I am, this is where I have strong convictions, even acknowledging those of others.
There seems to be, I'm sorry for interrupting, there seems to be a fine line as a pastor of, are you going there to represent your church or your own personal conscience?
Right.
And how do you that, we talk about that at the pastoral staff here at DCPC. That's a balancing act.
It is. I agree with that, and I would like to think that it's not, when we do that, it's not just about our own personal conscience, but because we're thinking about what God might be calling us to express on God's behalf to a congregation of people who are seeking a word from the Lord. So that's, I'm sure I didn't always do that right, but that's what we seek to do, because among the challenges of planning and leading congregational worship is, when we put it in theological terms, we understand ourselves to be speaking to a congregation of faithful people who are wondering, is there any word from the Lord? Yeah. But sometimes it feels as if there are people who want to be entertained. I think it goes back to Søren Kierkegaard said that we shouldn't think of the congregation as an audience and the people leading worship as the performers. Rather, it's the congregation that is offering something to God when we worship together, and the worship leaders are sort of the coaches and cue givers in the performance we're all supposed to be about.
I'm struck by how you're reading Bonhoeffer as a young kid, enriched your life as an adult in taking a stand and facing the consequences and the difficulty. Yeah. We need to move fairly soon to,
Yes.
I don't even want to look at the clock, to retirement. When did you decide, and how did you decide, and what did that look like? And now you're in Davidson, and how did that happen?
I went from Statesville to being Transitional General Presbyter of Salem Presbytery. That was supposed to be for 1.5 to 2 years. It ended up being 2.5 years. That too was a very stimulating experience. I got to go to General Assemblies. I'd been a moderator of my presbytery for 2 years before that. So I got to visit and preach in churches large and small, and try to be of support to leaders who were taking the presbytery through major transition. Congregations, governing bodies everywhere have been doing this for some time. So it was rather traumatic for a lot of people, because it meant the person I was following had retired. The changes coming meant that the staff was their time of service was ended. They knew to expect this, because the members of the staff, more than anyone else, were familiar with the numbers that we were having to deal with about people and the like. So it was a challenging time in that way. The pandemic started during that time 5 years ago. I think the most important thing I did in that role was, I recall, to back up slightly, as we were all starting to see more and more news and to become concerned about that, I remember seeing that leaders of Seattle Presbytery had made a recommendation that their congregations, you might remember, that was one of the areas hit harder sooner, but they recommended that congregations suspend in-person worship. And I was just amazed at that, and it was sort of an indication. Little did I guess that the next week I would be doing the same thing. So, and I suspect it was probably true around here. The first Sunday for suspended worship was March 13th. And I remember one of my friends who's a pastor, yes, John?
2 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, really? Okay.
One of my friends who's a pastor said, oh, this is going to be many months. I thought it was going to be a few weeks at first. But I would say the most important thing I did in that role to me was try to connect congregations and ministers in the serving congregations with trustworthy resources from state health department and other such things. So, of course, nowadays we have people trying to undo all of that, but that's another topic.
There's more. There's so much more. I think that rather than even starting, if we really only have 2 minutes, I want to thank you for your faithful journey.
Thank you.
Thank you for the difference you've made in people's lives. And the difference that you've made in ours, just hearing your story this morning. This has been a real gift.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Steve.
So nice to be with you all.
Yeah. Would you ever teach for us in the Covenant Club?
Yeah, I would. I'm in the